Before we begin, let me give you a quick challenge. I'm going to introduce a few people, and I want you to pay close attention. On the far left is Daniel. Next to him is Ryan. Then there's Ethan, followed by Alex, and finally me. Got it? Okay, quick test. No rewinding, no cheating. What was the name of the third person I mentioned? If you had to stop and think for a second, or if your mind went completely blank, you're not alone. In fact, you may have just experienced something that happens to millions of people every single day. Maybe you've met someone, shaken their hand, heard their name clearly, and then somehow forgotten it almost immediately. And if that sounds familiar, there's a very good chance this video is about to explain something you've wondered about for years. If you've ever forgotten someone's name just seconds after hearing it, you know how uncomfortable that feeling can be. Someone reaches out their hand, introduces themselves, and before the conversation is even over, their name has already vanished from your mind. It gets even worse when you've met that person more than once. Maybe it's the third or fourth time you've seen them, and you still can't remember what they're called. Suddenly, a simple conversation starts feeling like a minefield. You avoid using their name entirely and replace it with safe words like bro, buddy, or my guy. All the while, you're secretly hoping someone else will say their name first and rescue you from the situation. The awkwardness can be surprisingly intense. You start wondering what they think of you. Are you being rude? Do you seem careless? Do they think you don't value them enough to remember something so basic? For many people, the embarrassment quickly turns inward. They blame themselves, assuming they have a bad memory or that something is wrong with the way their brain works. But the truth may be far more complicated than that. But what if forgetting names doesn't mean you have a bad memory at all? What if the problem isn't carelessness, low intelligence, or a lack of social skills? The truth is that there may be a very specific psychological mechanism influencing this behavior behind the scenes. And once you understand it, you may start seeing yourself in a completely different light. In this video, we'll explore why some people constantly forget names and uncover a few surprisingly effective techniques that can make remembering them much easier. To understand why names are so easy to forget, we first need to understand how the brain actually works. Your brain is not designed to store every piece of information that passes through it. In many ways, it's an optimization machine. Every second, it filters, prioritizes, and discards enormous amounts of data to save energy and focus on what seems most meaningful. And surprisingly, proper names often rank very low on that list. A name like James, Sarah, or Michael is usually just a sound. By itself, it doesn't automatically create an image, emotion, or story in your mind. It has very little for the brain to connect to. That's why names can feel strangely empty compared to other kinds of information. Think about attending an unforgettable concert. Years later, you may still remember the music, the excitement in the crowd, the lights on the stage, and the emotions you felt in that moment. But there's a good chance you won't remember the seat number printed on your ticket. Why? Because the seat number was only a label. It helped you get inside, but it wasn't the experience itself. A person's name often works the same way. The name is the seat number. The person, their story, their personality, and the way they made you feel are the concert. Your brain doesn't always forget the person. Sometimes it simply throws away the ticket after you've already entered the show. Another reason names are so easy to forget is something psychologists call cognitive load. Imagine your working memory as a small desk with limited space. The moment you meet someone new, that desk becomes crowded almost instantly. Your brain is analyzing their face, reading their eye contact, listening to the tone of their voice, and interpreting their body language. At the same time, it's trying to form a first impression and figure out whether this person seems friendly, trustworthy, confident, or nervous. But that's only half of what's happening. While you're studying them, your brain is also turning its attention back on you. Am I making enough eye contact? Do I sound confident? Am I standing awkwardly? What should I say next? In the middle of all this mental activity, the other person casually says their name. Unfortunately, that name often arrives at the exact moment your attention is already overloaded. It isn't that you don't care. It isn't that you're disrespectful or inattentive. The problem is that your brain is busy processing dozens of social signals at once, and the name simply doesn't get stored properly. Sometimes, the name isn't forgotten later. It was never fully recorded in the first place. A famous psychological experiment known as the Baker-Baker paradox helps explain why names can be so difficult to remember. In the study, researchers showed people a photograph of the exact same man. One group was told that the man was a baker. The other group was told that the man's last name was Baker. Surprisingly, the group that learned he was a baker remembered the information much more easily. Why? Because the word baker, as a profession, immediately creates a network of mental associations. You might picture fresh bread coming out of an oven, the smell of flour, a bakery on a busy street, or someone wearing an apron covered in dough. The brain has something to connect to, but when baker is presented as a last name, those connections disappear. It becomes nothing more than a label attached to a face. This reveals something important about how memory works. The brain is not designed to store isolated facts efficiently. It prefers images, stories, emotions, and meaningful connections. A name by itself often feels abstract and empty, while a story instantly creates hooks for memory. The richer the associations, the easier the information becomes to remember. That's why you may struggle to remember someone's name, but easily recall what they do for a living, where you met them, or the interesting story they shared. Your brain naturally prioritizes meaning over labels. The first psychological mechanism is surprisingly simple. Sometimes you don't actually forget the name because you never fully remembered it in the first place. Most people assume memory failure happens after information has been stored, but in many cases, the real problem occurs at the moment of introduction. Imagine someone reaches out their hand and says, "Hi, I'm Michael." It sounds like you're listening, but part of your attention is already somewhere else. You're thinking about what to say next, how to make a good impression, whether your voice sounds natural or whether you're coming across as awkward. Instead of being fully present, your mind is quietly rehearsing the next few seconds of the conversation. This is especially common for people who are highly self-aware, socially anxious, or prone to overthinking. They often spend so much mental energy monitoring themselves that very little attention remains for the information being presented. While the other person is sharing their name, an internal dialogue is already running in the background. What should I ask next? Am I smiling enough? Did that sound weird? The result is that the name never receives enough attention to be properly encoded into memory. It's like trying to save a file on a computer while 10 other programs are competing for processing power. The information briefly appears, but it never gets fully stored. If you've struggled with this your entire life, it may not be because you have a bad memory. It may simply be because your attention is constantly being pulled into self-monitoring, anticipation, and social analysis. In other words, your mind is already living in the next moment before the current one has even finished. The second psychological mechanism is much more interesting. What if you don't actually have a bad memory at all? What if your mind is simply paying attention to different things? Some people naturally focus on surface-level information, such as names, job titles, or social labels, but others seem to absorb something deeper. They notice the feeling a person creates, rather than the label attached to them. You may forget someone's name within minutes, yet still remember that they made you feel unusually comfortable. You may remember the warmth in their smile, the exhaustion hiding behind their confidence, or the way their eyes seemed distant whenever they talked about their life. You might recall that they appeared lonely, overwhelmed, excited, or quietly hopeful. You remember the energy they carried into the room. You remember the story they shared, the passion in their voice, or the emotion that briefly surfaced when they thought nobody was paying attention. In other words, your brain may be storing the experience of the person rather than the name attached to them. If someone asked about a person you met recently, you might struggle to remember whether their name was Jessica, Jennifer, or Julia, but you could probably describe their personality in remarkable detail. You could explain what they cared about, what they were worried about, and how they made other people feel. That isn't necessarily a sign of poor memory. It may be evidence of a different kind of attention. Your mind is prioritizing emotional and social information over simple labels. While other people are remembering names, you're unconsciously studying character, mood, and meaning. And perhaps that's why forgetting a name doesn't always mean you failed to notice someone. Sometimes it means you notice far more than their name. You notice the human being behind it. The third psychological mechanism is different from the first two because, in this case, the memory may actually exist. The problem is that you can't access it when you need it most. Have you ever been talking to someone and suddenly realized you needed to say their name? Maybe you were introducing them to another person or saying goodbye at the end of a conversation. Then, without warning, your mind went completely blank. You knew the name. You could almost feel it sitting somewhere in your memory, just out of reach. But the harder you tried to grab it, the farther away it seemed to drift. This often happens because stress interferes with memory retrieval. The moment you realize you've forgotten, a wave of pressure appears. You don't want to embarrass yourself. You don't want the other person to think you weren't listening. You become anxious, and that anxiety creates even more mental noise. Suddenly, you're not focused on remembering the name anymore. You're focused on the fear of forgetting it. The harder you force yourself to remember, the more blocked the memory becomes. Then something strange happens. A few minutes later, after the conversation ends and the pressure disappears, the name suddenly pops back into your head with perfect clarity. That's because the memory was there all along. Stress didn't erase it. Stress simply made it harder to access. Sometimes the problem isn't that your brain forgot. It's that anxiety temporarily locked the door. But what if you've been looking at this the wrong way all along? What if constantly forgetting names isn't always a sign of weakness, but a clue about the way your attention naturally works? Some people move through conversations collecting labels. They remember names, job titles, and small details with impressive accuracy. But others seem to absorb something deeper. They remember the story behind the person. They remember the emotion in someone's voice when they talked about a difficult chapter of their life. They remember the excitement that appeared when someone described a dream they were pursuing. They remember the quiet sadness hidden behind a smile, the warmth of a kind personality, or the unique energy a person brought into the room. If someone asked you about a person you met weeks ago, you might struggle to recall their name immediately. Yet you could probably describe exactly what they were like. You could remember their perspective, their values, their humor, and the feeling they left behind. In that sense, perhaps your brain isn't ignoring people at all. Perhaps it's paying attention to them in a different way. It isn't focused on the label attached to the outside. It's focused on the human being underneath it. Names are important, but they are only the surface. Character, emotion, personality, and lived experience run much deeper. And sometimes the people who forget names most often are also the people who notice those deeper layers most clearly. The good news is that even if your brain naturally focuses more on people than names, there are a few simple techniques that can dramatically improve your ability to remember them. The first is to repeat the name immediately after hearing it. Instead of simply saying, "Nice to meet you," try saying, "Nice to meet you, Sarah." This small action signals to your brain that the information matters. The second technique is to turn the name into a visual image. Names like Rose, Hunter, or Ben become much easier to remember when they are linked to a mental picture, such as a rose flower, a hunter in the woods, or Big Ben in London. Third, don't try to remember the name by itself. Attach it to a story. Rather than memorizing David, think, David is an interior designer who recently moved from Chicago. Context creates stronger memory pathways than isolated information. Fourth, use the person's name again before the conversation ends. Saying something like, "It was great meeting you, Kevin," helps reinforce the memory one final time and leaves a positive impression. Finally, if you meet a large number of people, don't be afraid to take notes. A quick reminder in your phone, such as Amanda, Marketing, Met at LA Conference, can make a huge difference weeks later. None of these techniques require a perfect memory. They simply help your brain create the associations it naturally prefers. Maybe the best way to think about a name is as a key. A key is important because it helps you enter a house, but it isn't the house itself. The house is where the memories live. It's where the warmth, meaning, and human connection can be found. In the same way, a person's name is often just the entrance. Their personality, their story, their struggles, their dreams, and the way they made you feel are what truly matter. Sometimes your brain accidentally drops the key along the way, but that doesn't mean it forgot the house. In many cases, it remembers the house remarkably well. It remembers the feeling of being there long after the name itself has faded away. So if you've spent years criticizing yourself for being bad with names, maybe it's time to be a little kinder to yourself. You are not broken. You are not careless, shallow, or disrespectful. You're human. Like everyone else, your brain has strengths, limitations, and its own unique way of paying attention to the world. The goal isn't to shame yourself into remembering more. The goal is to understand how your mind works and build small habits that support it. You can improve your memory without turning every mistake into evidence that something is wrong with you. If you've ever had an embarrassing moment where someone's name completely vanished from your mind, share your story in the comments. And if you know someone who always says, "I'm great with faces but terrible with names," send them this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more insights into the hidden psychology of the human mind.